But this is actually a really great opportunity. So what I'll do is I'll introduce Dr. Paul Mitchell, and we're going to give you a lecture on a Canadian perspective on military design education practice. I don't want to steal his thunder here, but it's really fascinating because Dr. Mitchell is one of the key military educators when we talk about who's doing military design and who's implementing it formally into their professional military education. And Dr. Mitchell is going to be telling you about at least the past almost decade of trials and tribulations and lessons learned. I was very lucky, I was fortunate enough to be brought in early on this. About 5 or 6 years ago, while I was still active duty, the Canadians were really, before JSOU, having me come and teach and experiment and try crazy things. And that's really benefited the program here because some of the things I was able to do there have been implemented in the course that you're now experiencing. But with that, Dr. Mitchell is located in Toronto and is now the director for academics at the Canadian Forces College. So he's at a much higher level, but he's still heavily involved with the design vision and how they're implementing at their war college and at their intermediate level education for all Canadian forces that come through Toronto. So without further ado, Dr. Mitchell.
Yeah, I just want thanks for that intro, Ben. I just want to state up front, I have no background in design, educationally speaking, or training, or what have you. And you'll see in the presentation, this is something that we stumbled onto. You know, a good idea fairy type thing that actually came true in many ways. And so coming down and working with Ben and Nate and the other team down here is a real learning experience for me too. In terms of how we do things around here. It's a terrific opportunity to be here in front of you. What I'm going to be talking to you today is about the evolution of practice and the education of that practice. And they're two separate things. You're talking in your classroom about practical issues. How do we do design? But there's another meta level to that as well, is how do we actually teach design? And that's a trick. That's probably as complex a problem as actually doing the design itself, because you can all read a book on design, but that doesn't necessarily make you a designer. You can go and do a 4-year program at the Rhode Island Institute of Design or what have you, or School of Design, and that's 4 years, but you only get like a couple of weeks. Here at JSOU or up at CFC, are you a designer after that? Can you compare these two things? And so how do we effectively teach people these things and make it meaningful for their practice is one of the big things. This is a tale of a journey where the destination is never really reached, but much is learned along the way. And this is a reflexive journey in the sense that we're really thinking about what it is that we're doing and how we set out to teach others. But ultimately, the lessons that we've taken away so far have all been about ourselves. So take that for what it will. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this. This is the whole thing. Two practical problems, and one I should have added one big theoretical problem. A little bit of an intro on our war college and on our command and staff program and how that all fits together in terms of design. And then in terms of reflective approaches, this is all about getting students out of their mental boxes and what it is that we're doing there. Reflections on pedagogy, getting deeper educational results by looking inward at ourselves as opposed to at our institution and our students. And then finally, the long and winding road that leads to, well, we're not really sure, but I'll talk a little bit about expertise and humility in that regard. So, senior PME in Canada, up until 1994, we had a war college. It was known as the National Defence College. It was based in Kingston, right beside Royal Military College. It was famous for having its own tasked Air Force 707 that flew the students anywhere they wanted to go, literally. They had a year, they had set curriculum in Kingston, but they flew all over the world. Of course, mid-1990s, this is getting really expensive. People are looking at it, and the budget cutters came and they killed it. And then they realize, oh, shoot, we just killed our senior PME. What are we going to do about that now? And so all of that material got transferred about 2 years later to Canadian Forces College. And we stood up, so about four-year period of figuring out how they were going to do this. And they came up with the National Security Studies course and the Advanced Military Studies course. And the guidance on there is typical institutional politics. You can do anything you want, but you can't make it look like the NDC because we can't appear to have made a mistake. And so the NSSC was all about national security, is all about strategic studies, is all about institutional management. And then the AMSC is interesting because it was aimed at officers, much like yourselves, who had come through the PME system in Canada in the 1980s when we weren't talking about operations and operational art and operational campaign design and so on and so forth. And so they hadn't got all of the bump on that and knew what these fancy diagrams meant and how to use them in planning. And so we were bringing colonels, senior colonels, back up to speed with the AMSC course, and we sort of based it loosely on the Higher Command and Staff program in the UK. And then in 2009, we re-looked at the whole thing and we merged these two courses together. And it's now, since 2009, we've been teaching something called the National Security Program. Now there's two practical problems that confront PME in Canada. So first of all, what do we teach? And from a professional perspective, we get all that guidance from something called the Officer General Specification. But if you read the Officer General Specification, it's just a series of training tasks. There's no educational program in there. And then how to teach, we knew we had to teach it at the graduate degree, but when you look at the Ontario guidance on what graduate education means, it's equally, there's these graduate degree learning expectations, but it really doesn't tell you anything about, you know, how you put a war college program together. So the challenge from the professional side is developing coherent education out of a series of training tasks. How do you do that and keep your hand on your heart and say, yeah, we're respecting the intent here? And on the other hand, credible education, we got to offer a degree. Ontario regulates how we offer degrees, but it really isn't going to tell us how we do war college education. So credible education is the other problem that we face. There's a theoretical problem on top of that, which is Canada is a geographically large nation, but in terms of its population and its economy and so on and so forth, it's relatively small. And in fact, worse, it's pretty damn secure. When you look at the geography of this, I'm not sure if there's a, yeah, so off the coast here, 3 oceans and the United States. Those are pretty big walls for anybody. And in fact, assaulting this amphibiously, you know, you can figure out the math on that. People worry about this stuff up here because almost nobody lives up there. And there's a lot of resources, and of course with global warming and loss of, you know, what's the threat to, is there a threat to the Arctic islands? And of course, we basically say, yeah, they could take it. We're probably going to have to come and rescue them afterwards. So it's pretty harsh climate up there, very, very difficult transportation, logistics. Yeah, I would like to see somebody try and take it from us. Let them try anyways. There's a bunch of different schools of thought, however, and they're all related to this geography. So in the 1920s, one of our senators, yes, we do have them, came up with this notion of the fireproof house, which is Canada's far removed from flammable materials. We're a fireproof house. Nobody really can touch us. We don't have to worry about security all that much. In the 1940s and 50s, we talked a lot about middle powermanship, and this is coming out of the Second World War, which is we had the 4th biggest Navy, we had a pretty large army, we made some significant contributions in World War II, but at the end of the day, we're still, you know, we're not Russia, we're not the United States, we're not the United Kingdom, but we can do things. And that's this notion of middle powermanship, or helpful fixers. We can go out and do things. We're just not a big state. And then there's the whole geographical determinism, and in the 1970s, a Canadian political scientist talked about defense against help, which is basically the only thing we need to really worry about defensively is just keeping the United States happy with the efforts that we're making. Because we don't want you guys to come up and help us with these things. That would be a disaster strategically. So as long as we do enough that keeps Americans secure, that their northern frontier is more or less secure, that's basically enough. Now what this all means, that we're now entering this world of great power competition, and you may not have noticed, but the US, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, the big powers have all taken pot shots at Canada in the last 2 or 3 years. And it really, well, right now there's the Meng case. I see your question right there. There's the Meng case. 2 Canadian diplomats have been basically taken hostage because we've taken the Huawei's, the founder of Huawei's daughter. She's under house arrest in Vancouver because of some sort of trade violation with the United States and is facing extradition. So China has been taking shots at us. Saudi Arabia basically cut off diplomatic relations because of an ill-advised tweet from our foreign affairs minister. India is not happy for a variety of reasons. Russia has banned our foreign minister from going to the country. And so a lot of countries are basically pointing fingers at Canada right now. And given the fact that we're a small country, even though we're secure, geographically speaking, and secure from invasion, but there's a lot of other ways that states can affect us right now. And so what does that mean for a small country in terms of its strategic behavior? We really can't look at the United States or Britain or any of those other aspects to figure this out. And that was the problem that we're confronting when we start putting together this NSP in 2008. And in particular, that AMSC course that I was talking about, that was the military component of the new NSP. And so how do we teach senior military officers about operational warfare when Canada really doesn't practice that all that often? We're a niche contributor to coalition operations. We send over capabilities, but we really don't lead in many respects. And so how do we teach that? I was involved in this with my partner, Colonel Howard Coombs, a SAMS graduate. And essentially we said, okay, we know we have to teach this at the graduate level. So this is not going to be a how to do course, this is going to be a how to think course. Basically what we came up with was this notion of critical operational epistemology. Let's take a look at the toolbox and see what's in it and see whether it works. Now in particular, the thing that struck us was in fact that looking around at recent operations, we see highly efficient warfare, but relatively ineffective wars. Why is that? Why aren't we able to translate military force into strategic outcomes in the way that we've been associated with, historically speaking? And if you look at doctrine, you start at the very bottom with your tactics and drill manuals down here, and you work up through operations and your joint pubs, and then your strategic pubs right here. What you're seeing is down here, very simple descriptions. This is how you do it. X, Y, and Z, you get these results. Do it that way every time. Up here, the guidance is a little bit more general, a lot more general, and up here, very, very generic advice. There's not a lot of how to do up here. It's more how you're thinking your way. And essentially, as I point out here, is as you're moving up this spectrum of activities, you're increasing the complexity of the problems that you're facing, the number of actors is increasing, and the degrees of freedom that they have in choosing things is growing exponentially as you go up. You'll note that everybody has pubs that go all the way up to here, your strategic joint pubs. NATO doctrine is not what we're talking about up here. This is how do you deal with things like frenemies? How do you deal with red cards in operations? How do you deal with caveats? How do you deal with the fact that your most effective partner in Syria happens to be, Hezbollah? And up here at this level, these are whole of humanity problems, we call them. Cyber warfare, pandemics, demographic change, human migration. All of these things require everybody to work together. Climate change is another great one. Everybody has to work together. Even your enemies have to work at this level. Doctrine in these two levels is never going to emerge because you're at such a level of complexity and such a level of interactivity at that point. There's no way you can write it all down so that you can get procedures for people to do things. And so, given the fact that much of the problems that we're dealing with are at this level, what are we teaching people? We can't go back to the manual. We have to do something different. So we did, let's go on here. The other thing that, and I've talked a little bit about this up here, for a small power, there really is often a separation of strategy from operations or tactics. Why did Canada go to Afghanistan? It wasn't because we were strategically compelled in the way that the United States was strategically compelled to go to Afghanistan. We weren't directly attacked, but we suffered the after effects. And where did we suffer it? We suffered it on the border. The border got shut down for several days. I live in a border community. I watched the highway back up with tractor trailers and that sort of thing. People can't get across the border. And we recognize that we have a strategic problem. We have to ensure our standing with our larger partner, the United States, on our allied status. And so we go to Afghanistan to solve that strategic problem. Now, if you are the operational commander in Afghanistan, the Canadian operational commander, that really doesn't give you a lot of guidance as to what it is you want to do over there. It basically means go over there, do good things, stay out of the news. Make sure not too many people get killed. Or in this case, actually, we're kind of comfortable with getting people killed because, you know what, that blood, skin in the game, shows that your commitment. But it doesn't really help you in that strategy, operations, tactic line, what have you. So the other thing that I would say is civilian academic faculty here is largely deriving or developing the educational course at this point as well. And so the journey is much as I put it down here. My journey is learning about the parts in the context of the whole and the whole and the components of the part, and I'm spiraling through this. Anybody who's got a little bit of, I don't know if Ben or Nate have talked to you about the hermeneutic circle, but that's basically the hermeneutic circle right there. And that was effectively my journey as a civilian academic, war studies degree at the master's level, political science. I've done all sorts of strategic studies and that sort of thing. But that doesn't give you any sort of background in terms of operational art. So that's the challenge that we're going through. So critical operational epistemology was useful, but students were frustrated because they're practitioners, they're professionals, they want answers, they want solutions. And as much as we can tear something apart, it doesn't necessarily give you the tools to put it back together and create something different. And so as instructors, we're wrestling with that problem. The students are appreciating the discussions, but they're not really getting what they need as professionals. And at this point, that's why I call it stumbling into design. I happen to pick up a recent copy of Military Review, and lo and behold, there's an article by Steve Banich and Alex Ryan talking about SAMs and design thinking. And a couple of other things that I stumbled on in that period. And I said to my colleague Howard, I think we got an answer here. This is something that seems to be putting that stuff back together. And so we started off in a very evolutionary, our very first activities were just a series of panel discussions. We had Alex Ryan come in. We had Roger Martin, who is a gigantic name in design, who was local to Toronto at the time, come in and talk about panel discussions. Opportunities. We had a operational level war game or war exercise that the NSP was doing, but it was all based on MDMP. And the colonel said, why are we doing this? We don't do this. That's what we have staffs for. Why are you making us go through this crap again? We did it 5 years ago. We don't need to do it again. So I said, let's go from problem solving to problem framing. And we brought in design, a very first design exercise, facilitated by Alex Ryan. And the students basically said, that was great, but we're not really sure we did design. We need some more, and so we started adding design tutorials. So you see there's an evolutionary growth of material that's taking place here. Now, by course 7, we kind of hit a high watermark. The stuff that you were doing in your class just now caused a rebellion. Somebody said arts and crafts. That's exactly what they called it, but they didn't mean that in a complimentary way. That was like, this is what my kids are doing in kindergarten. Why are you making me, a senior colonel, play with Play-Doh and plasticine and pipe cleaners and popsicle sticks, building these things? This is not serious. And we basically had, in the midst of a design exercise, a group of students say, we're not doing this anymore. We're stopping the exercise. We let them do an OPP type thing, and they went on and did it their way. We had to go back and reframe. Why did that happen? And so we said it's a narrative issue. We introduced new thing. We were going to talk about complexity, complex operational spaces. But bear in mind, this is a course that's about operational warfare, and all of a sudden there's all this design stuff, and people are saying, what's this course about? And so we reframed, and ultimately we came down, we said, it's not a course issue, it's a program goal. And that's when we hit the modern period with the NSP in this regard. About the same time, our command and staff program also was going through a major rethink, and we introduced streams. And what this means is effectively, because we only have one institution for professional military education, we don't have an Eisenhower school, we don't have an NDC, or NWC, we don't have all these other specialized schools that you have because of scale. We have to do more with our one institution. And so our command and staff program does things in strategic studies for those who are going to work on policy at NDHQ. We do on institutional policy if you're going to be a project manager, and the advanced joint warfighting concepts, or warfighting was for those people who are going into command. What's advanced, though? What do we mean by advanced? And this is where design came in. And we had a similar sort of event with the very first year, an OPP exercise down here, or MDMP exercise down here. And students said, again, what's advanced about this? So we moved to shifting sands and a design. So you've got the basic history of how it is that we moved through the introduction of design at the college. The big questions that we have with regards is constantly, how do we do this? The theories that you're being exposed to are very simple, but because there's all sorts of institutional overlay and professional understandings about it, and will they let you do a sand table? Will they let you do a role play? All the things that you're going to be doing to explain ideas. That makes it complicated. And in fact, teaching this stuff the way that Nate and Ben and Peter do, that takes a lot of experience and exposure as well. Like I said, I'm a political scientist. I don't have any background in this. The first time I tried facilitation, it blew up in my face. I still have PTSD over this. I don't go near it. Just because you study operations doesn't mean you can do operations. And in fact, this is exactly what Clausewitz is talking about when he talks about friction. It's all the things that you haven't thought about that actually get in the way of you actually doing it. On top of that practical issue, which practice should we be teaching? Should we be teaching the Army design methodology, which at the time was the dominant military form? Should we go back to what the Israelis had introduced, the strategic operational design? Well, we all kind of know. We've heard the history about that in 2006. We also had a whole series of civilian design models, and the connection with Roger Martin got us into Rotman School of Management at U of T, University of Toronto. And so we were getting civilian models as well. And then again, because we didn't have a cadre of facilitators, we had to bring people in. We had to contract them in. And they're all coming in with their different approaches. So we made a silk purse out of a pig's ear, effectively. And our design solution for this was something we call agnostic design, which is looking around, in fact, looking closely at the US Army and the debates that have gone on over ADM and whether this is the right way to go or not, whether this is just enhanced MDMP, whether this is more linear or what have you, really revealed that we didn't want design doctrine. We wanted a variety of approaches because each approach gives you a different perspective of the problem, and it gives you different types of solutions. And if we try to make a doctrine, it will be standardized, functional, and algorithmic. And we didn't want that. Design, we argued, was a way of thinking, not a process. And so this is actually thanks to Ben. This is his diagram here of what it is that we do at CFC. And effectively, what we talk about is emergent practice here. Is that by exposing our students to many different types of techniques, ultimately they may come up with their own particular forms of doing design, which are different or combinations of all sorts of. And this is a unique approach. We're the only school in professional military education that basically eschews the idea of teaching a particular approach. We actually try to expose our students to as many different types of techniques as we can. So the goal here is reflective students. Pedagogy, as I've suggested already, has to be reflective as well. So why do we do what we do? So the program aims at moving the student across this gap between what is to what might be. The known really determines what is. It's rational, it's functional, it's algorithmic. It gives you answers. The unknown, what the future might portend, is unknowable in many ways. But the students need to get across that gap. And technical mastery of history or procedure cannot bridge this. Because basically, what we're trying to create is that which is needed but does not yet exist. Has he used that phrase? Have you used that phrase with them? It comes from Harold Nelson, I think. So a move to a more desirable future. And desirable means it is normative in nature. And this goes back to the whole issue of efficient warfare, but ineffective wars. Wars are all about norms, the conflict over norms. And we are really good technical masters, but that technical mastery is not getting us to where we want to be. So we have to bridge this gap. We have to create that which is needed, which does not exist. And we have to recognize, and this is true for the United States as much as it is for Canada, that national security is a community of practice. There is no national security profession. Okay? There are many professionals involved in national security. It is a collection of professions. And because they're all aimed at solving national security problems, and you can see a whole series of acronyms here that essentially have to come together in order to get our student from here across to here. And the bridge is a really great metaphor. What we have to realize is that while it is a necessary metaphor to understanding, it is not a sufficient one. What type of bridge needs to be built? And effectively, bridges have to be fit for purpose, but who gets to decide what the purpose is? Purpose is problematic. It is in the context of inquiry that we begin to understand what that purpose is. So even though the bridge metaphor describes the problem, it still doesn't help us get across. And so oftentimes, I love this might be a generational thing. I grew up on Warner Brothers. You can't watch Warner Brothers cartoons anymore on TV. They're just so politically incorrect. It's impossible to see this. But the Coyote is he's a great character. And think about it, the Coyote is an engineer. He's a professional. He uses technology to solve problems. And what happens to the Coyote? It always blows up in his face. He always injures himself over. And what does he do? He doubles down. He does it again. Comes up with a more elaborate scheme. And what happens? It blows up in his face again. What the Coyote doesn't realize is that he's stuck in a context. The rules of the Roadrunner cartoon, and you can look this up on Wikipedia. There are rules to Roadrunner cartoons. The Coyote can never, ever capture the Roadrunner. He never does in any of the cartoons. If the Coyote realized that there are actual rules out there preventing him from gaining his goal, he might decide to do things differently. I can't do it with a Coyote cartoon, but think about Are you all familiar with the Holy Grail? Monty Python. So there's the great animation scene where they're being chased to the cave by the monster, and then all of a sudden the animator dies and the monster disappears. That's meta-level reflection. That's stepping outside that area and thinking, okay, this is the situation. The situation has rules. It's being directed in particular ways. If I transcend those rules, then all of a sudden I can find a different way of achieving things. If the knights knew that they could kill the animator, they would have had their problem solved. Thankfully, the plot allows the animator to die. But that's the meta-level reflection that we're talking about here. This is also true of our practitioners, that we need meta-level reflectioners. And this is my counterpart. He says I'm Batman and he's Robin. He's young. He's about 20 years younger than me, so maybe that's true. I don't know. I think he's more Batman than I'm more Robin, to be quite honest. But Philippe Boulou-Brassard, who's currently on sabbatical at the University of Copenhagen right now for the next couple of years, studying design education in a very design-oriented capital, is an interesting fellow. Politically speaking, Philippe comes from a Péquiste family in Quebec. Now that might make sense to the Canadian in the audience, but the Péquistes are the hardcore separatists in Quebec. And that's his family background. And now he's a federal public servant teaching the military. It's like the ironies abound. On top of that, his academic background is critical international relations theory, which is really, really anti-military. Very anti-military. And now he's working at a war college. And so he basically is using these tensions to understand the kind of, it informs his pedagogical approach. And under Philippe's leadership, we've taken the design tutorials on the JCSP. And so, for example, as an agnostic approach, the students will do the same problem 3 different ways over the space of a week. So they'll try it using a civilian design approach, they'll try it using an ADM, or they'll try it using SOD, or whatever. They'll pick 3, and then they learn. You know, if you do it this way, you get these kinds of results. If you do it that way, you get those kinds of results, or what have you. That's one of the things. The tutorials that are now come to us from the major commands. CANSOF, CJOC, SJS, NORAD have all participated directly in generating design challenges for us, which makes the challenge real. And the other thing that he instituted was a Dragon's Den. So getting in senior commanders coming in from our commands to actually sit down and evaluate the program, which again is sort of reaching out. And this outreach that is also important. IMDC is the International Military Design Conference, which Philippe is instrumental in arranging. It will be now in its 3rd or 4th iteration this year. And he's also the webmaster of something called the Archipelago of Design, military-epistemology.com. And I recommend everybody take a look and see what's on there as well. So a very reflective individual. It's also reflective in terms of what we're doing on the war college level as well. And I go back to that strategic thinking problem that I started off with. You know, the way we might do this if we were in the United States or the UK is to look at history. But whose history should we look at is Canada? Because the United States, Canada is not the United States. Canada came from the UK, but increasingly the connections there are dead as well. And so whose history? There's nothing really for us to base our theory about how strategic practitioners in Canada should act. And so, rather than fret about that, let's just get down and do it. Let's talk about emergent practice. And so, what we've developed for this will be an actually new, we have a series of 3 interrelated exercises plus a visit. And so the very first exercise they will do, which will start in January, is a strategic foresight exercise, which will be aimed at designing a Canadian grand strategy. Something that nobody's actually tried to do. You know, a containment strategy or what have you. That, in turn, will inform a linear planning exercise down here on regional strategy. Every year we take the colonels to a particular location in the world. This year we're going to go to the Ukraine, the Baltics, and to neutral Scandinavia, and thinking about Russia. And so how do we think about Russia within the context of Canada's grand strategy, which we've worked up here? They'll do the strategy, they'll go to the place, and then they'll come back and they'll reframe using a design technique down here. So you see a complete design loop in terms of the setting the environment, designing a prototype, testing it out, and then reframing down here. So what have we learned as we've gone through this? And what we've learned is much about what we really don't know. And I like to use the metaphor of a circle of light. As you pitch a circle of light on a dark stage, it creates a nice circle, and you increase the intensity and the circle expands. So the area of light increases as the circle gets bigger, but so does the circumference of darkness. So the more you get to know, the more you recognize just how little you understand. We've learned in this is it's all about endogenizing the problem. The rebellion that we confronted was because we didn't really explain prototyping particularly well, not like it's been done with you today. And so making it relevant, deep empathy with the client, for the client, is required in order to understand and practice design and practice good design education. It's not just about theory and structure, it is also about values and narratives. So understanding that institutional problem that everybody is confronting. You're confronting different ones in the US than we confront in Canada, but they're of a like kind. We can teach method, but can we create an artist? And that's essentially what we're talking about with design, is creating artistry. So you're all going to do this, 1 week, 2 week courses here at JSOU or up at CFC, but will that make you an artist? And I think people have asked the right questions on that as well. How do we scale this for a wider audience? It's just Philippe and I, 2 guys. We don't have a lot of facilitators. We have to bring them in. We would like to do the kind of outreach that actually JSOU is doing with a lot of militaries and even with Canada. But you can't do that on the backs of two individuals. We've got to teach a lot of other courses as well. And so how do we scale that? How do we create our own cadre of designers, either military ones or perhaps contracted facilitators? How do we mobilize support? Not just in the classroom, that ecosystem thing that I was talking to you about earlier, where we could talk about early adopters and using them to help the others along. But how do we mobilize support institutionally so that ecosystem is changing? And here, we think we're kind of being a little bit clever because we're teaching it both the similar types of design programs to both the colonels and the majors in the hopes that eventually they meet each other in the environment and they say, hey, I've had this idea about maybe we should do it this way, and the other one's, yeah, I've seen that, and let's try it. So, and how do we all reinforce this as a school? There's growing, the interesting thing is, while the NSP was marked by rebellion and resistance, right now it's not. In fact, the colonels are really leaning forward into this, and there was a major breakthrough last year where they did one of these arts and crafts thing, and really liked it. In fact, Ben made them wear Lego glasses with a narrative built around the frame, and they had to wear it down to the mess so that all the majors could see them wearing these glasses. And of course the majors would, sir, why are you doing that? Boom, into the into the discussion right there. 6 years ago, none of them would have been willing to do that. This year, every one of them said, sure, I'll do that. That's weird. Why did that happen? Where did they shift? Why did it take place? Because we've seen this as a trend over the last couple of years, and I can talk about that in question. On the other hand, there's a lot of frustration on the JCSP, and I looked at the review from last year, and a lot of people saying, what the hell are we doing? Why are we doing this? I would be able to do this better if I was doing OPP. Why are you making me do this? So there's that issue. Are we actually doing agnosticism in practice? How much exposure are we giving the students, and do we actually make them do a bunch of different things? Critique is a big problem, I would say. The critique that Nathan and Peter did with you today was amazing. I wish we were doing more things like that with our students. And then practicing design in the field. Those institutional problems, how do we address that? How do we overcome that? The $64,000 question, how do you integrate it with planning? We actually have a postdoc on site this year who's going to be looking at that. I doubt she'll answer it because it's a $64,000 question. But that is probably the biggest one that's still in front of design education right now. So, moving forward, we're actually facing a similar type of problem as we did with the AMSC. The reason the AMSC went away was that bow wave of career people who didn't get the education in the 1980s and 1990s eventually disappeared, and all the majors who did get it showed up as colonels. Why? You can't do the same course anymore. We're going to get the same thing happen in about 2 or 3 years, where the majors who got design on JCSP are now going to show up on NSP. What are we going to do with them? How are we going to do design differently with them? That's a big question that we're wrestling with. We've instituted this year something called the Department of Innovative Studies, and that's one of those things that's going to do experimental work for trying out new ideas at the college and trying out different things and different approaches and taking big risks. And then lastly, the outreach. BB's sabbatical in Copenhagen is a major strategic investment. We're giving him 2 years away from the college when we really need him to work at the college in order for him to become a much better design practitioner. And so he's got big expectations when he comes back. The outreach to organizations like this, the other one that we're beginning to develop interesting relationships is the Australian Defence College. And that was our distinguished visitor from last year, who came and facilitated our programs. We're reaching out to universities in terms of the University of Waterloo, which for many of you may have heard, is one of the biggest engineering schools in Canada. It's actually one of the big engineering schools in North America. They have design programs. We have an Ontario College of Arts and Design University, don't ask, in Toronto, and we're beginning to outreach there. And then lastly, conferences. All of these things in terms of helping us move forward. The big thing that I want to leave here on this is this notion of passionate humility. Everybody in this room, me included, is an expert in something. You all are professionals, we're all professionals, and professionals are all about solving things. And so we bring that expertise to solving problems. But as you're learning, sometimes your expertise isn't as good as it could be for solving a particular problem, and you need other types of expertise to help you solve those problems. And so, while you can be passionate about your solution, you also have to be humble that you might just be wrong. And bringing those two things together is probably one of the big goals that we have in terms of our design education in that. And it also goes to the educators themselves. Doing design is an enormous institutional risk. And I've already talked about how we kind of were able to do this because nobody was paying attention to us. People are starting to pay attention to us. I got a recognition from our Chief of Defense Staff just last week for the types of things that we're doing in design at the college. Well, if the CDS is paying attention to that, it means the entire institution is now looking at us. And are we doing the right thing? There's been a lot of buzz about design, and you can associate to any kind of process change management type theories that that airport books that they're a dime a dozen. What if we're wrong? What if this is just a big fad? What if we're all existing in our own professional educational echo chamber on this? Do we believe what is true, or just what we want to believe is true? And how do you know the difference between those two things is a big question. What we teach the students and what we try to do as practitioners, as educational professionals, is this notion of triple loop learning. So we're all very comfortable down here, lessons learned, all that sort of thing. Did we do the right things? Do we do things right? That's training. It's easy to do. We do it instinctively. Did we do the right things? Methods of effectiveness. Okay, that's not too bad either. We kind of are. Militaries are very comfortable here. They do this sometimes, and they do it not too bad. This is the one that's really challenging right here. How do we decide what is right? What is the right way of doing something? That is exactly the question that you're asking. And that is all about passionate humility, right over here. Recognizing that there is expertise to be brought, professionalism to be brought to bear. But is it the right type? And are there other ways of doing these things? And that goes not just for the professionals that we're dealing with, but the educators themselves, constantly. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions at this point, and thank you very much for your attention.
So just with the questions, we just ask, raise your hand, grab the mic, that way we can capture it. We have some hands over here.
Thank you very much for that. Whoa, that's too loud.
Thank you very much. So one question I had was, you mentioned that you were going through a process and then you're going through the process again as far as you spoke to senior personnel who received the course, right? So you had a senior colonel or senior general and they've already received the course. So you said, how do we give them something, how do we teach design?
Yeah, this is the challenge that we're going to face in the next 2 or 3 years is how do we update our design for colonels when we get them, and they know what design is. They know what we don't have to teach them about it anymore. We don't even necessarily have to teach them how to do it because they've been through these sort of work. And they may have practiced it, who knows? So what do we do now? How do we keep that sort of critical focus going forward? That's a big challenge. I don't know if you had thoughts on that, but
No, I guess I'm just saying, why get to change it? I mean, I understand that maybe they have a basis in it, or they have a foothold in it,
Yeah.
or maybe the concept is that they already know it, so it's already like they're experts at it.
I'm not. I mean, those are good questions and observations, and we do have people practicing design in the Canadian Forces right now. We're building up our sort of knowledge of who's doing what. We bring them in to talk to our students from time to time. In fact, tomorrow we'll do a panel, and the J5 from our CJOC, which is, it's like any of your COCOM type organizations, only much smaller. The J5 for that, he's a design practitioner. He used it in Afghanistan. He's going to talk about how he uses it with his staff. So that does exist. And I think we have to be aware that some people are going to come with that knowledge. Other people may have just sort of brushed it off and never come back to it. But as we move forward, we're going to have to think more and more about how do we do this with people who've already got some knowledge about design, and and that may be more about how you manage designers, as commanders. You're now the commander, you've got planning teams. How do you make sure that you do that convergent, divergent, diagram so that you get as much you get as much juice out of your staff as you possibly can? And that goes back to that $64,000 question, which I don't think any military really has an answer to yet. It's really sort of, it very much is a craft approach right now in terms of, well, I've got some ideas and some heuristics and some rules of thumb about how we do this, but there isn't any doctrine for how it works best. And so everybody's got a lot of different practices. It's all emergent practice at this point. And can we bring that a little bit closer together so that at least we get some contextual stuff, if not an actual doctrine or a set of rules about how to do this? I think we're going to confront that faster in Canada than you will in the United States because we're much smaller. I mean, just to give you, you'll know this, you can put the entire Canadian Armed Forces inside our biggest sports arena. All the regular serving personnel in the Canadian Forces will fit in Skydome in Toronto. Everybody. Yeah. Keep that in mind. It's a village we live in. We don't live in a city like you guys do with all sorts of things. It's everybody knows everybody ultimately. So we're going to confront those things, I think, faster in Canada. And we're going to have to come up with some answers. And we really aren't going to be able to look to you or to the Brits or to anybody else to solve those problems. We're going to have to create them for ourselves. And that is probably one of the biggest design challenges that the military faces right now, is how to solve that.
Quick question on how you see you call it constructive contribution warfare.
Yeah, which is actually a phrase was invented by our current Chief of Defense Staff when he was a major at our college. He wrote a paper on contribution warfare. And he wrote it in a very cynical frame of mind when he did it, and now as the Chief of Defense Staff, he says, yeah, that's exactly what we do.
Right. So trying to wrap my head around that as I'm getting in the seat up there, how is it possible to create a grand strategy, and I assume that is a military grand strategy, absent, especially with the Trudeau administration coming up on its election, minus any real military grand strategy, or even in a lot of other places, grand strategy from your government?
So,
How does
yeah.
that affect the design?
Yeah. So first off, I would say that there's a difference between military strategy and grand strategy. They're completely different things. Military strategy is oriented towards victory, defeating the opponent, doing that in the most cost-effective and quickest way possible. Grand strategy is about creating conditions for peace, which is, and those two can work exactly the opposite. You may need to work with your enemies under a grand strategic conception, whereas you try to kill them on the other side. So they're very different. And grand strategy sits above all military strategy in the sense that it directs the resources and energies of the country towards particular ends. Those earlier, I'll just flip back quickly to them. Those earlier ideas that I put out for you. So these ones here. Nobody recognizes them in academic literature as grand strategies, but I would say they're all grand strategies for Canada. They're not particularly well, I would say they're all bumper stickers. There's no big, deep set of thinking like the X article or the long telegram on underroad containment for the United States. There's actually a couple of articles by Niels Orbeck on this particular thing. People write about middle powermanship, and that was just a mic drop comment by Senator Raoul Vanderan in 1920 when he was saying why Canada wasn't going to intervene in the Ethiopian crisis, because we don't need to, is basically the whole thing. But what I would say is the Canadian government is very much wrestling with grand strategic problems right now. As I said, China is our #2 trading partner right now. The United States, by a long shot, is the #1. About 70% of our exports go to the United States. So you're going to be our #1 trading partner for a long time. But China comes in afterwards and has now banned canola. It's banned meat and pork products. It's a whole host of things that are going on with that, and it seized 2 of our diplomats and is holding them almost incommunicado in its jails. We have significant problems with Russia. We have tense relations with India. Saudi Arabia, like I said, cut off diplomatic relations when we complained about how they were treating their dissidents. So a lot of people are looking at Canada, and I would say it's almost as if, because of the type of policies that Canada has tradition, not just the Trudeau government, most Canadian governments talk about values and the projection of Canadian values. And I would say that authoritarian countries around the world would love to make examples of us. This is what happens when you pursue these types of policies. This is what happens, so be careful. And you can do that to Canada. So we're an easy target in that regard. And that requires us to think carefully about how we behave on the, for too many years, we've considered ourselves isolated and therefore untouchable. We can adopt the type of policy because there really is no cost to any of these things. But increasingly there is, because of the nature of information, because of the nature of globalization, because of trade. All of these things mean that, and migration in particular, our diverse population, come to Toronto, go to Vancouver, even to Montreal, and you will see incredibly diverse cities. People come from everywhere. It's like New York, except even more. The biggest Chinatown in North America is in Toronto. People don't know that. Which also are vectors for influence into our country as well. So all of these things mean we have to think strategically, but we can't use the examples of any of our partners because they have different traditions, they have different political realities, they have a different context. So back to your point, if these guys don't do it, who's going to do it? The nature of professional education in the public service means that only the military has the resources to actually devote a significant amount of energy and people power to this sort of thing. Our public servants don't get these opportunities to come and reflect on what it is they do. And so they're all just constantly doing it by the seat of their pants. The military actually has 10 months that it devotes to colonels. We're going to be working at that level, and we do it with an interagency crowd, just like you do with your senior colonel education here in the United States. And so it's a perfect lab to do these sorts of things. I know from my contacts within our equivalent of your National Security Council, we call it the Privy Council Office, it's so quaint. That this is a problem that they're confronting. I know from my contacts in Global Affairs Canada that they're really worried about, we're out there operating without a good grand strategy, without any sort of notion, without any guide rails as to what it is we're doing. And so it's a huge, huge problem. And I come back to it. If we don't do it, who's going to do it? Yes, it's just one section of that community of professionals, but at least maybe we can get the ball rolling and that. And so that again is that ecosystem argument that I talked to you about earlier, is create the conditions that enable the conversation to begin at least. And I think that's very much a design exercise as well. If we go back to my comment from Friedman, that strategy is the art of creating power, then bringing communities together so that they can have those conversations and agree upon the goals that they will pursue is about that process of creating power. And so strategy is all about, ultimately, getting people together to talk about things so that they can agree about what it is they want to do. Back there, Nick.
Thanks for the kind words and the feedback. Pleasure to have you this morning, and to hear it from a professional is much appreciated. Having read a bunch of your stuff and having the pleasure of seeing you present at a variety of conferences in the last couple of years, you clearly had a path of policy and strategy, a future that you could have gone down. Yet you've taken this personal and professional risk to immerse yourself in the world of design and sort of hang your hat on that and try to bring it to life in your organization. Any thoughts on just tell us what inspired you to do it and why? Why go down this path?
So it goes back to that discussion that my colleague Howard Coombs and I were having about what it is we were going to teach colonels at this level, and how we were going to do that in a way that was both professionally credible and academically coherent. And as I said, we knew we didn't want to do a how to do, talking about procedures and this is how you do this is how you do that. It was more about, it was really about that, why aren't we being successful? What are we being challenged by? And that was an interesting academic mystery for me to engage with as an academic. What is it about the environment that makes this happen? And I think it is about the nature of the institution that you work in terms of we want professionals to be successful in their career. We want them to be able to go away and say that education was meaningful to me, that I've been able to alter my practice based on what I've learned in Toronto or in Tampa or wherever. So that was the sort of professional motivation for this. The risk was something that I don't think we realized initially. And in some ways, JSOU, and even SAMS, and some of these other there's bigger risks there because it's been done in a much more public fashion, in a much more open fashion. There's been journal articles or what have you, but in Canada, CFC has been a neglected institution for a very long time, and we've had to work with constraints. That exercise that you did this morning, working with constraints, is exactly the kind of thing. What do you do when you don't have enough people? What do you do when you don't have the resources that you would like? But you still see where you need to go. How do you work with that? The fact that we weren't being paid attention to in many ways allowed us to take risks that we could manage in particular ways. That we could fall down 2 or 3 times without people saying, all right, that's done, you're finished, out the door, find something different. And that happened, and we learned from those things, and I think we created a much better a much better program. But it is, I will say to everybody, I mean, design is a dangerous discipline. And that's true even outside of the military context. When you think that 90% of startups fail, they fail because they designed their products not the right way, and they weren't able to get the market that they were expecting, and the company collapsed. Money's lost, you know, the personal toll of losing, you know, what it is your dream, and the financial aspects, the reputational aspects that are all associated with that. Those are gigantic risks that people take. They take them every day in the business environment. So it's a risky venture. It's always a very risky venture, and because you're dealing with these normative struggles, you don't know. There is no right or wrong. There's only better or worse, and you'll only find out whether it's better or worse once you engage. So you can't manage those risks away. You have to step into the arena and put it out there and hope that it works. And it really is. The last thing that I should have ended on, I wrote it down, but I wasn't looking at my notes. Hope is a COA. Right? We often hear that. Hope's not a COA. No, we got to have a plan for that. No, hope's not a COA. Hope is definitely a COA, because it is all about the future, and the future is undefined, that we create the future. And so that question about bones and meat that was going on around there, you're going to have to create that structure. You people in this audience, you can't wait for the leader to come out and say, notice this wonderful little science fair project that you've built over there, and say, wow, good job, Fido, you know, do more of that, you know. That's never going to happen. You have to create the future. And it is in courses like this where you're sharing these ideas and you are creating communities, and you go back into a community and you may encounter others who are thinking in the same way, and you begin to make those connections. That is creating the future. That is creating the organization and shaping it in a way. And again, huge risk. Huge, gigantic risk that I won't put it down, because many of you are going to fail, and you may pay the ultimate career price, being asked to leave the service early. You know, it's something that you love, and not succeeding because you took that risk and you died. Well, that's military affairs in general, I guess, as well. He who dares wins, I guess. Or we who dare win, to be politically correct. So that, you know, motivational speech here, I suppose. But that is the essence of the problems. There's no easy way to do this. You're just going to have to do it.